Hello and welcome to this British Academy event. I'm Hetan Shah, Chief Executive at the British Academy. I'm delighted today to be joined this afternoon by Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. He's Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge, a British Academy Fellow, and lead author of The Economics of Biodiversity, also known rather appropriately as the Dasgupta Review. This was commissioned by the UK Treasury back in 2019 and published earlier this year in February. It's very timely with COP26 and COP15 coming up later this year, and also very complementary to the wider work of the British Academy, where we're exploring how the shape disciplines, this is the social sciences, humanities and arts for people and the economy, feed into questions around sustainability of the environment, of the economy and of society. And we're doing work publishing briefings on our website in the run-up to COP26. We have a new policy program, Where We Live Next, exploring sustainability through the lens of place-based policy, and a whole series of articles coming up in our open access journal over the coming year. So Partha and I will be speaking in conversation for the next 40 minutes or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions you might have, and you can submit those through the Q&A function right the way through this discussion. So please do go ahead and do that whenever you want to. And of course, we encourage you to tweet or use any other kind of social media that you like. The British Academy handle is @BritishAcademy_, if you want to copy us in as well. So, Sir Partha, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. The Dasgupta Review, it's an enormous and comprehensive review, over 600 pages in full. You explore the value of biodiversity to prosperity and also the losses that we might face to our prosperity if we're risking our biodiversity. Could you give our viewers and listeners a bit of an overview of your findings just to kick us off?
Well, the findings at one level is, of course, very grim. The demands we are making on the biosphere currently far exceeds the biosphere's ability to supply the goods and services on a sustainable basis. We can continue doing it for a while, but we are eroding the biosphere as we continue to do. So that's the first point. The second point is that there are many things we can do to ease this burden that we've imposed on placed on the biosphere, and they appear at a variety of levels, from the very local household level via the village to the region, nation, and the international community as well. And the review addresses that, but it does so by viewing the biosphere as an asset, the bits and pieces of the biosphere as an asset. And in some sense, the title is a misnomer. It's not really the economics of biodiversity. The review is about the economics of the biosphere. And we take as a unit of account ecosystems and the goods and services ecosystems provide us with. And we build the economics of that.
Can you just clarify, what do you mean? What's the distinction here between biosphere and biodiversity? What do you mean by biosphere?
Well, it's the difference is a bit like having a portfolio and asking whether the portfolio of assets is diverse. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. It's a feature of ecosystems, the diversity of life within the ecosystem. But the ecosystem with that diversity produces goods and services, and that's what we're trying to understand in the review.
Okay. And what are some of the recommendations you say about how things could be changed? What are some of the areas where you make those recommendations, for example, around the food system or banking and so on?
Well, there are so many. I'll just give you a couple of illustrations. At the national level, of course, there's one class of policies would have to do with reducing the subsidies we offer on the exploitation of nature. The review estimates something like $4 to $6 trillion per year is the global subsidy for natural capital, which makes much of nature have a negative price, by the way. And then there's, of course, swaths of nature which come free. So there is that to deal with at the international level, say the open oceans, open seas, beyond the mile exclusive economic zones. Then there are the global public goods like the rainforests, peatlands. They need subsidies. In other words, you need to subsidize or you need to transfer resources to the countries that house them because they're supplying a global public good and yet would be bearing the cost of preserving them. So that's just two.
Sure.
Many others.
This is a very interesting point about subsidy, that we subsidize things which are negative. What are the ways in which governments are doing that?
Oh, energy subsidies, for example, water subsidies, to make it much less costly to take water from the ground from the aquifers. There is a sense in which we are subsidizing the use of the oceans by not charging for their use.
Yeah.
They come as a free good. We say it's a free good, but of course it's finite amount, and then all the traffic that takes place across the seas and that takes place in the seas are of course eroding the character of the oceans. Yeah. Sorry.
If we were to wean ourselves off these subsidies, for example, around energy, there will presumably be some impacts on some of the poorest in society. And is that something that you've thought about in terms of the distributional aspects?
Of course, the review goes deeply into these issues, but there's always these problems. It's not unique to the economics of the biosphere. Many of the policies that we have an impact which is disproportionate on the poor, tax rises and so forth, but there are ways of trying to buffer it. But there are many things we take for granted which we can face up to. For example, suppose, just for the sake of argument, suppose there was an institution given the authority to charge for the use of the oceans. All right, every time you send a container across the seas, you have to pay something for the right to do that. Okay. Well, the revenue that you collect from that would be just huge. I mean, the global revenue would be just gigantic. About that would be used for development purposes, if you like, greening landscape, taking pressure off ecosystems. It's just that we've got a hugely distorted set of crises that we face, making nature very cheap and therefore running it down and accumulating instead produced capital, manufactured capital. And of course, health and education, those are the good things. And all of them are good things, but they're coming at the cost of something else, which is very good, namely our productive base.
So some of the things that you're talking about there require, in a sense, new kinds of governance arrangements at the international level. Those have always proven to be quite tricky to create and manage. Have you found examples in the past of where that has worked well, or have you got sort of reflections on how that might be made possible?
Oh, yes. I think in some sense we've become spoiled. I think the last 60, 70 years have been so successful for the global economy. I'm not talking now about the distribution of wealth, but I'm talking about the average person is so much better off. We've gone really spoiled in not recognizing the benefits we have enjoyed by cooperating at the international level. Successes you ask for, Hetan, plenty of successes. I think the World Bank is a very good example. The IMF is a very good example. WHO is a very good example. Then there's this huge swath of agreements regarding, let's say, space, all that air traffic that takes place. It doesn't happen just like that. There's a huge amount of agreement across countries as to, to allocate the space and time for travel. So yes, we have plenty of. I mean, if we put our mind to it, given how urgent and important the problem is, worrying about creating an international institution it's just a luxury that only the self-indulgent can use. Can afford.
Now, you talked about success, and I think one of the things that the review talks about is how we think about and measure success, and there's some skepticism towards the notion of GDP. So can you say a bit more about that and how you would value and measure success?
Yeah, so the review is, I'm an economic theorist by training and inclination, so and theorists urge the inner drive of a theorist is always to unify rather than separate. So things that looks different, you try to understand through one framework, and that's the goal of any kind of science, any science. You make distinctions, but then you make the distinction with the view to seeing that they're connected. Otherwise, you have disparate things. Okay, so what the review does is to recognize that measures of economic success, what the metrics we use, are not unconnected from the way we choose projects, the way we make decisions in other spheres. So assessment is related to evaluation. Okay, so the unifying theme here is that we should be after the wealth of nations, not the GDP of nations. And the reason is that GDP, which has very strong properties, it's a very useful item for macroeconomic management, but they're short-run macroeconomic management, but somehow it's been transferred to serving as well as an index of economic performance over the long run. And the real weakness about it, serious weakness, is its gross domestic product. It does not net the depreciation of capital. And when you have the biosphere in mind, ecosystems in mind, natural capital in mind, if I'm using these terms synonymously, then of course that's a great error, because the whole point is that our past development, development paths the world economy has followed over the past 70 years, which the review shows in great detail, is one where you've accumulated produced capital and human capital, but we have decumulated natural capital. But that's not recorded in GDP because depreciation is not counted. So we should be looking for stocks. The measures should be on stocks, our inventory of stocks that we hand over from one year to another, to the next, and thereby to our descendants. So, I mean, it's in a way, it's so intuitive. I mean, a household, a father or a mother hands over, bequeaths to the children assets, and it's not income.
Sure.
It's assets are things. Sorry.
Well, with the British Academy, not only do I need to look at income and expenditure every year, I need to look at our balance sheet, right?
Exactly. And so you got the right expression that nations should, just like private companies and British Academy, nations ought to create our balance sheets.
Yeah. And do you think that any countries are doing that well at the moment, leading the edge?
Yeah, it's progressing. This is now becoming much more mainstream in thinking, even amongst within governments, and some are ahead of others. New Zealand is pretty far up. I mean, England, UK is doing very well on that. We have a natural capital committee, so there's a separate account for natural capital. At this point, the idea should not be to amalgamate everything into one single indicator, because that would be really, we just don't have the data or the confidence to be able to do that. And the lack of confidence is a good thing here, by the way. That means you shouldn't overstretch what you have, so to speak, and go beyond what you can do. But there's no harm in having a vector, a list of assets, and saying, well, here are the wetlands have been deteriorating. Okay, keep that in mind. The coastal waters are in trouble. Keep that in mind, and have some description of those assets as part of your ONS estimates. Okay.
And I suppose some people, especially within the kind of edges of the environmental movement, have put the blame on economic growth itself as an issue. How would you, as an economist, suggest we think about that question? Well,
in some sense, the review addresses that all the way through, although some parts tangentially. By economic growth, I guess people invariably and rightly think in terms of growth in GDP, because that's how we've used the term. So the fault is not the idea of economic growth. The fault is the idea of what that growth consists of, growth in what. And there, we've really gone awry. No question about that, because as we just remarked a few minutes ago, what's happened is that we've really been eroding one asset structure really seriously, particularly due to the growth in the rich West. has caused this a lot. And because of trade, you transfer these depreciations onto poorer countries because it's from there you're getting the raw materials and using for production purposes. So the trade itself has been a rather, as the review tries to make clear, this globalization in many ways has had a really bad effect because this has been, in a sense, untamed globalization. That's the right way to put it. Globalization is nothing particularly wrong about that, but it's untamed. You're not charging for many of the goods that you're trading. And so the burden falls on those countries which are actually sitting on the natural capital, which is underpriced. Okay. So you can see there is a kind of a transfer of assets that have been going on in a hidden way. And even my most left-wing friends, if you like, quote unquote, traditionally left-wing friends, haven't actually noted that, but instead they've talked in terms of exploitation and unfair trading and so forth. But here it's all very part of a system in which natural capital is underpriced. From that follows many things, even without any conscious, behavior which is wrong.
Yeah, and I suppose one reflection is that in recent years the issue of climate change has been taken much more seriously. And of course, there is a link between climate and biosphere, but the issues that you've explored, I think, have been underexplored until now. And have you got a sense of why that has been and how we can help put that right?
I think one reason is that the climate scientists have been much more active. It's because they have been active because you can talk about climate scientists. It's one metric, one simple index, and that concentrates mind. The index being, let's say, just for the sake of argument, carbon concentration. Why am I interested? Why are you interested in carbon concentration? Well, because it is a feeder into the climate system. How do you model? How do you think of the climate system? Well, it's become customary to look at mean global temperature, and that carries with it, of course, a whole variety of descriptions of climate, extreme weather events, and so forth. And then why is the economist interested? Because she wants to know the feedback from there to economic output. Right? So you've got a nice, very well-defined mapping from emissions to concentration to climate back to economic production. So it's been a very happy coincidence of interest. As opposed to biodiversity, which is, of course, extremely heterogeneous, and it's heterogeneous for a variety of reasons. One of them being Mother Nature produces not just climate regulation, doesn't regulate only climate, but it does millions of other things, pollination being another, nitrogen fixation being another, decomposition of waste, you name it. Yeah. And they are all interconnected. So you perturb climate, the other things, it affects other things. And when other things happen, the climate is affected. So there's a mutual feedback, and they're complementary. That's the one very important insight of the earth sciences. It's a complementary in the sense that they're not independent of each other first. Worse, they're not even substitutes. They're complements. So if one goes down in a big way, then like a house of cards, the others collapse as well. So in a way, the economics of climate change has been very narrow, because it just looked at one without looking at the effect on the other. And so the narrowness has made it much easier to study, because you can have controversies, but the controversies will be over one number, let's say. Should we charge $40 per ton or $100 per ton of emissions, or $10 per ton for emissions? My review doesn't talk in terms of social cost of biomass. It doesn't talk about biomass at all, except insofar as the ecosystems that are producing goods and services. The review is much more capital theoretic, if you like. It sees the problem as a portfolio management problem of different types of assets and the goods, the returns that they offer. Yeah.
And you talk in a way about market failure and the fact that certain things were not priced or priced in the wrong way. But you also talk about institutional failure. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, because so much of our activities are not mediated by the market. I mean, just think of a village in middle of sub-Saharan Africa. Many of the activities, household daily activities, water collection, fuel wood collection, and so forth, are not governed by the market system. There are norms of behavior and so forth. So, and of course, I mean, that's just one extreme. So we have an entire system of the way we live is influenced by not just markets, but a whole set of rules and regulations and that are done through norms of behavior and customs and so forth. So in this particular case, when we look at the way we use nature, it's not a problem of going to the supermarket and paying your price. It's really a question of engagement with things we do when we are outside the market system too. So institutions are overarching. Markets are just one small part of institutions. It's the one which we economists study because there are records. The price I pay at the supermarket is recorded. So somebody can go and confirm what I've done. But I go trampling over the meadows. Who's there to keep a record of that? There are no transactions there. It's an open access. Let's say the meadow is, and I go for a walk. And actually, there is something going on there, right? So yes, it's institutions, and it's a failure of institutions. It's a much deeper set of issues here than would be simply say there's market failure.
And how far has this been a failure of economics? I mean, there's been various critiques of economics from outside of the discipline, that it hasn't taken the environment sufficiently into account, or that the conception of humans as maximizing sort of rational agents was too narrow, and that institutions weren't taken sort of sufficiently into account. So how far did these external critiques of economics sort of feed into your thinking, and where do you think some of these critiques have actually just missed the mark?
Hetan, you really have done your homework on this. That's very good. Lovely question. That would be very difficult to answer it in a brief moment. I think we have a lot to answer for. It's not so much really the rational actor model which is at fault. It's what we're rational about, which has been overly narrowly defined. I said in some sense, much of economics is really a supermarket view of life. Transacting. You have a clear idea of what you want and everything. So it's not that. So it's not really that. The absence of nature is serious criticism, no question about it. And recall that remember, there is a lot of very good work that's been done on ecological economics. Sometimes they would call it environmental and resource economics. But what you are alluding to, and you're absolutely correct in suspecting that's the case, you won't find many of them in economics departments. I'm one of the real rarities. And that maybe because much of my work was not on environmental economics. So my tenure decision, the decision to give me tenure was not based on my work in this. So I think that's something we really need to face up to as a profession. And I'm hoping very much that the Royal Economic Society will take this on board, that where are the wonderful ecological economists, and there are plenty of them. You'll find them.
Many of them come from the engineering profession with a kind of more system.
No, less there. No, it's there. They appear in schools of the environment. Say Yale has a school of forestry. Duke has an absolutely magnificent school of the environment. Terrific work goes on there. Duke University, and you'll find them in ag econ departments in America, in the United States. You'll find them here in geography departments. But not in economics departments. And the prestige lies in the economics departments for an economist, that is, because they color what is regarded as the major economics journals are there. And the most famous journals, the most popular ones, the ones young people want to publish in order to get tenure, and they're right in thinking they need to publish to get tenure, by the way, are absolutely desolate in my subject, in the area of what the review covers. The Quarterly Journal of Economics, for example, has not published a single paper on climate change. It was reported the other day by somebody who actually did a tabulation. Now, why? And that's the number one journal. We have sort of a ranking. Everybody ranks journals these days, as you know. So yes, I think you have a right to people who complain about that have a right to do that. the problem is not economics. It's a fantastic subject. I mean, I could hardly write the review, my colleagues, if I didn't have a really solid intellectual base on which to embed the economics of the biosphere. It's the way we've chosen to cultivate the subject. And it's not, economics as practiced is not narrow. It's got a lot of interesting things. Behavioral economics is very interesting, extremely interesting. It has infiltrated the subject in a seamless way, but not the economics of biodiversity, or if you like, the economics of the biosphere. I don't know why, but that's how it is.
I mean, you know, you're animated about the value that economics can bring to these problems. Can you say a bit more? I mean, there'll be lots of non-economists who are viewing or listening. Some of the tools of the trade that have helped cast light on these sustainability issues from an economics perspective. What is in your toolkit that makes it so valuable?
Gosh, that's a hard one. I think the fact that we were bold enough. I mean, look, this is, I'm taking a risk now, because what I say may well be off the mark. I can't tell. I'm not that good at understanding my own subject and the nature of academic disciplines, or the evolution of it. But I think the move towards quantification in economics, which started a long time ago, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, was terrific. And the post-war period, where we very self-consciously became quantitative, mathematical for theoretical purposes, econometric to handle data sets. That involved a certain narrowness of vision about who we are, humans are. Okay, it's easy to criticize that, but the payoff has been fantastic. Because if you start by saying we're too complicated to study, we humans, then that's the end of the matter. That really closes the discussion. And all you can do is to spend your time thinking about how complicated we are, and aren't we rich here, and aren't we interesting there, and so forth. They become descriptive, and we may enjoy doing that. And there's a lot of lovely articles I read in intellectual journals which do that. But at the end of the day, for public decision makers, what is the Chancellor of the Exchequer to do when he or she wants to know what will be the outcome if I raise the rate of income tax by 10%? I need to have some quantitative understanding of what it'll do to what the response will be. Now, how are you going to do that without a quantitative model? And if you have a quantitative model, how do you reach that quantitative model? You need to have an understanding of the fact that the Chancellor is facing so many million citizens who are going to react to his 10% hike in the income tax. Okay. Now, what's motivating each of these individuals? So you peel the onion, so to speak, and then study that, the representative individual, if you like, and then say, well, the representative individual is not just he's an average. Then there'll be a distribution. So now income statistics, because you don't have to worry about the distribution of tastes, income, blah, 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 and so forth. Okay. I think the fact that we became narrow in that dimension was very, very beneficial. It sort of swept us, I think rightly, into a terrain where we could actually have sensible discussions, and then proven to be wrong. That's very important. If I start by saying we are terribly complex and so forth, we will never be proved wrong, because yes, we are complex. But the information content of that observation is not very much. So I think that's been very good. Where we've gone wrong, obviously, is having overlooked something extremely important in our lives as part of the apparatus of living. And that's, of course, what the review is about.
And economists weren't alone in that. I mean, I think, it's not a sole problem for economics. How do you think economics needs to evolve now? I mean, you talked about there are still these incentive problems in terms of, if you're an early career researcher and you're trying to get ahead, you've got to publish certain things in certain journals. They may not actually be publishing the kind of work that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So yeah, what about the incentive structure within economics, and also the teaching of the subject?
Well, I think you're pointing again the right. Yeah, I think you know what the answer is because the way you posed the question, Hetan, that's terrific. At the individual level, at the young researcher, he or she has not very much choice. I wouldn't ask him or her to say, now be noble and work in this field and then find yourself a job if you can. Because he wants or she wants to be in the economics department, then I'd say, well, the chances are rather low. So don't do that. Obviously not. If I want to advise somebody for a career, that would be a different answer. I'd give a different answer to one if a chairman of a department asked me. The problem is the chairman of a department also suffers from the same problem. He or she could say, well, I'm responsible for the quality of my department, the reputation of my department. And if I become an outlier to the rest of the world in terms of having, I want, you see what I mean? How do I attract high quality graduate students and so forth and so on? So we got what we economists call a Nash equilibrium, but a bad equilibrium whereby it's not in the interest of any particular individual to make a move because everybody else is in the terrain. Okay, so who can do this? Well, one thing that I feel a bit puzzled about is why the top ranking departments don't make some move. Because they don't really risk that much by having a small group of people they hire very consciously and say, well, we're going to have we have economists in health, we have in education, we have in behavioral economics, finance. These are standard subjects, or growth and development, and so forth. We should also have a section of our department over these issues. Now, for a large department, and the best departments are quite large, almost by definition, like in Harvard or Princeton, or I dare say in Cambridge, we can afford to do that. But we're not doing that. They're not doing that. That's really odd. The other thing I can think is vice chancellors, presidents of universities, if they sense that they need to, then they could push. After all, there are many, many levers. If a department is going down the tube, then central authorities do pump money into it, but they reorganize it. This happened before in many other cases. In my lifetime, I've seen rather second-rate departments becoming first because the central authorities pump money into them and change the composition of the department. That can happen. You need external advice, of course. Goes without saying. So I think in principle it can be done. As I say, no particular department has an incentive to make that change because it's very risky.
Yeah, and it's worth saying, certainly at the British Academy, we see ourselves as a kind of locus for bringing some of that interdisciplinary thinking together, or kind of new ways of thinking about the discipline.
Yes.
Not constrained in quite the same way as universities, although...
That's a good point. The British Academy is a good example in the sense that of what we've been discussing so far, which is in my section, the economics section has only 2 people of my type, one of them which happens to be me. The other was elected last year, I think, or this year. Last year, I think. Yeah. So it's a very small, and it's a large section, as you know.
And I think this is where, in a sense, that the sections, as you say, are organized by disciplines, but actually the ability to bring people across those disciplines together is one of the things we can do.
Of course, absolutely, quite right. That's one of the glories of our academy. That's right.
Now, let me we've got some questions rolling in about 5 minutes. I'll be turning to those, but just to remind our viewers, do submit questions, and we'll be coming to those shortly. Partha, I think you and I went down a little rabbit hole around the profession of economics, which I think is kind of mutual interest, but let me just come back a bit to the biosphere and what needs to be done. Politicians often kind of exhort us as individuals to make changes in our lives. My own instinct is that sometimes it's a bit unfair to put so much pressure on us as individuals to kind of think what is the right thing to do, and I've often felt that it's up to more public institutions, be that the state or business and others, to think about these and make it easier for individuals to make those actions themselves. So how do you see the balance, or where should we put the energy?
I think your sense is right. In my judgment, because again, it's too much of a burden on the individual. In any case, unless people coordinate, even if individuals do take action, they could be counter to one another. So coordination is, of course, a very important thing. And the one way of doing that is to engage in collective action. And one way of engaging in collective action, and the particular one route in which collective action is deeply needed, is to urge governments to impose conditions on the way we are able to live. Now, that sounds very odd because we're in in a society where we value our freedoms enormously, and we're told, reminded every day, and rightly so too. God knows it's an important thing. That goes without saying. But one of the things that we economists have been good at trying to understand and explain, as with political philosophers, as one of our adjoining sections, is that there is great virtue of collectively agreeing to tie our hands. And that makes us even more free. And the entire system of the laws and norms of behavior are precisely that. That we're all forced not to do things.
Yeah.
Right. And we do that. And why do we choose to do that? Because it enlarges our space, like being able to live, if nothing else. Otherwise, it can be chaos. So I think that's where a lot of the action is. And I feel that just at the moment, I guess I'm going through it's been a rough time this last year and a half and so forth, is that with my findings in the review, I really worry, I feel saddened, if you like, that we are so self-absorbed now in the Western culture, the young, about identity, about many things that are important. I'm not belittling it, but in contrast to the problems we face about what we are leaving behind for 100 years' time, 50 years' time, 100 years' time for next generations, they pale into insignificance, not for the individual, but for the collective body. And we've seen how only a few weeks ago, this is something that occurred to me the other day, that a few weeks ago, when there was a move towards creating a super league, European Super League in football. Think of the ferocity of response from concerned citizens, i.e. football lovers, which turned it upside down within 2 days. And they were fighting whom? Extremely wealthy people. I mean, the owner said, disgustingly rich, right? So if that energy could be channeled towards getting governments and our communities to work in harness, finding ways, not the answers, but finding ways to make the biosphere look more expensive, if you like, more precious in our own personal life, then our personal responsibilities will be much easier to handle, because we will be guided by the don'ts and nots of action. But unless we do that, if the citizen does that, it's not going to happen. So the review is very democratic that way. The whole book is, the 600 pages are addressed to the concerned citizen. And I make it explicit in the preface, as you probably noticed. It's not addressing governments, it's not addressing the private sector, but it's telling this, suggesting to the citizen how they should view the government's responsibility, how they should view the private sector's responsibilities, and how a CEO, as a citizen, should view the workings of the company of which he or she is the CEO. Because we all have dual, at least multiple roles to play, right? I mean, you may be head of Exxon, but you still probably are a grandfather or grandmother or father or mother. So that tension is there in everybody's lives. And the idea is to get the tensions to ease, to align the activities in such a way. So I think the role of the citizen is extremely important.
Yeah, well, I think that's spot on, that we shouldn't necessarily be thinking every day about how do I, minimize my environmental impact per se, but actually put pressure on governments to get the political will. I mean, we've seen so much technical policy work done, which shows the way forward, but actually if the political will isn't there to enact it, then things don't happen. Although I might challenge you a little bit on, you made a slight throwaway remark about the young. It has felt to me actually that the young have been quite instrumental in pushing forward the environment.
No, I couldn't. Of course, you're quite right. But I mean the what I read so much, at least in the university environment these days. That's all I meant. Of course, the young have been fantastic over climate matters, for example. Sure. Yeah.
Now let me turn to some questions we've got coming in from our virtual audience. There's a lot of really interesting ones here. So you've got Denise, who's asked in relation to the purpose of the inquiry. She said, what has most surprised you in the inquiry, or most impacted your personal feelings as you did the review?
What surprised me was, in many ways, that's a lovely question, and thank you for asking. What surprised me was how easy it was to write the review. It sort of flowed. It took me about 6 months to realize that I was not writing on biodiversity and that I was not going to embed it as an extension of the economics of climate change, which is what I had been thinking for the first 5 months before putting anything down seriously. But about December 2019, I suddenly realized that I really had to talk about the entire biosphere as a capital theoretic problem, and then come down from the global to the local and then back again to it. And that flowed very easily. So the surprise was that I was able to do it in essentially a year's work. Yeah, but it did involve waking up every day, by the way, during the lockdown, I should say, every day at about 4 in the morning.
Wow.
Getting about 3 to 4 hours of work before breakfast, bringing my wife early morning coffee when she knocked on the wall. It was a sort of a ritual, and 7 days a week for an entire, from March to December, I did not have a single day off. So, but it was easy. It was easy because it was coming. I really could see the whole thing in one. Yeah.
Great. We've got a question from Jason Spinney in relation to institutional failure. So he asks, with widespread institutional failure at the heart of the problem, what is the one most important thing that we at home, I suppose as individuals, can do to effect change in the time available? And then a sort of follow-on part to that, without sugarcoating, what will be the short and long-term effects of this change to our lifestyle?
Golly, I think engaging in the community over environmental issues, particularly in an urban-based context of our lives, say around the British Academy. For those who are listening in, maybe we are urban people mostly. The local community, yes, that's where much of the action is, improving the greenness of our surroundings. That can happen with very little expenditure. It's happening in my neighborhood in Cambridge. Getting engaged with NGOs, local NGOs, green NGOs, that would be, it's also very fulfilling to do that. So I would say that, and would it make a lot of difference? Well, you have to work it out yourself. There are non-green objects on offer in the market, and you like them, what can I say? I mean, there's a limit to what one should do for, to have a flourishing life. Keeping aware of the fact that we are trashing nature in a big way as a global system. And then there are a lot of predators around, and you can't really have. But I think doing local activities really has high payoff. Can you imagine if all people, every locality in England, spent a bit of time each week in some collective effort in expanding the green space, planting trees and so forth, and creating a hub where people could congregate?
I think it's a wonderful and maybe slightly surprising answer that you've given, because I mean, the way the question was framed, I think that they were looking for, something difficult that we will have to do, whether that is becoming vegetarian or never flying again or whatever it might be. But actually, what you've offered is something very positive, which will, I think, allow people to, as you say, be part of their local communities. And so it's not necessarily something that reduces well-being, but increases it.
Yes, it increases it. And bear in mind that this also has knock-on effects, because you may, as a community, as a group of friends around the neighborhood, decide that, look, do we really need to go abroad this summer? Or shall we have a vacation in our country? And if others do it, it will be less painful if you don't do it. It's unilateral decisions which are the hard ones, goes without saying. So yes, something like community engagement, I think, is a very nice start, because it enhances your well-being. Yeah.
Now I've got a bunch of questions relating to economics, so I might give them all to you in one go at the risk of
Okay, I'll write it down. I'll try and write it.
So you've got from Fiona Stafford saying, thank you for this brilliant review. And she wonders what you think about the way economics has taken natural metaphors such as growth and used organic ideas at the expense of the natural world where these ideas and principles originate. So has economic society made the model of perpetual growth seem somehow natural and therefore inevitable? And is there a way in which those terms could be reconsidered? And then there's a related, I think, question from Atul, which says, as economics has been a core part of the problem of sustainability, how can it now be part of the solution? Should we not change its ontology and paradigm? And then a third question, as I say, they're interrelated but a bit different, from Mark Robbins, which says, assuming that we might progress to eco-economics, are there multiple or single models that we might care to consider in the immediate future?
Gosh, wow, that's somebody doesn't like me out here, obviously. Very lovely questions. Thank you very much. Metaphors, yes. Well, of course, metaphors are extremely important, necessary. They guide us. The problem I have felt over the years with relying exclusively on metaphors is that they can be hugely misleading and at the same time not do very much for us. I think they're a very good starting point. And I was some moments ago, I was praising my ancestors, my economics ancestors, that is, for having narrowed the vision of the confines of our analysis to one which yields quantitative, disciplines us into making proposals. So that led to additional metaphors. You're quite right. It's not metaphor to model, but it's metaphor to model to metaphor to model to metaphors and so forth. So you're quite right at that. And at every stage, we needed to be alert to what we are missing. And I think I've had an easy time. I haven't had to go into big things like paradigm shift or anything like that. It's just that a huge chunk of our lives has been missing from our lives when we study it, or when the study of our lives. Now, when you do that, the first port of call is not to say, well, I'm going to forget the language I've used. That's not going to help me very much. I want to know the technology that I have in my possession, in the mental technology that I have in my possession, the tools that I have. How can I adjust our understanding of the world that I live in and make recommendations on? By including that chunk that's missing, that seems to me the first port of call. Now, if the review doesn't deliver in our understanding, then I would say yes. The whole of my subject is sitting on it. I rather doubt it, by the way, I should say. In fact, I'm pretty confident that we are on the right track. But it's easy to talk about paradigm shifts, but constructing one and showing that it's actually doing the job for you, being able to give the answers that you need, and being able to respond to the data and see, well, it's some form of falsification, if you like. That's the hard job. And I've always felt very comfortable about the language of economics, so long as every now and then you breathe air into it and give a more liberal interpretation to the language. So when I use the word asset, somebody might think that I'm just a fund manager, because he or she also uses the term asset, a portfolio of assets, right? But for me, of course, if you read the review, asset immediately gives you a completely separate, different meaning. It's a real stuff out there. Trees are assets. Earthworms are assets. And they do their thing, so to speak. And they have intrinsic value. They also have use value. And if you're looking at what they do for me, I need to know what they do for me. And that's not the entire justification for their existence, that's for sure. But to start with that is not a bad idea, because if I can show that what they do for me is so important that we mustn't trash them, then I've gone a long way.
Yeah, and of course, I think there's a tension there, isn't there? That some people feel that by putting a price on nature, it's so instrumental that you're in effect denying its intrinsic value,
Yeah.
and you kind of economistic view of the world. Whereas I think what you're saying is that you need to do both, and that we're sort of missing a trick if we don't do one, because we are driven by instrumental concerns as well as intrinsic ones.
Yes, because that's absolutely, and the intrinsic ones are extremely important. It goes without saying. Every culture has sacred growth. Sacred. The notion of sacredness is not restricted to India, or Amazon. People living in the Amazon. That's even the most sophisticated person takes some things as sacred. Say a promise that he or she may have made, that's sacred, up to to some extent. How we treat our parents, whether we visit our parents on, okay, keep in touch. That's a pretty sacred thing, and you feel terribly bad about it. It's not okay if you don't do that. So that's for sure. And the review does not price nature. In fact, it makes it absolutely explicit. The idea that the entire biosphere can be priced is just rubbish. Chapter 1, it makes it quite clear. What it says is you want to look at the relative worth of varieties of ecosystems, and we perturb them. And how should we think about that? And as you rightly point out, that we need to, we could start with the instrumental values, use value, as I keep on saying, but that's limiting, obviously. But it's important, extremely good first step, because the instrumental value gives us a huge, long way. It tells us we really have to care about the biosphere. And we have to care for it even more, obviously, if you add further types of values to it.
But I think a key point of your review is to say that we have always assigned an instrumental value, but it was zero.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's right. I don't know if I've covered all this up. I think I've suggested this idea of paradigm shift. I don't know. Some people might say that the review is a paradigm shift. I wouldn't go anywhere in that direction, because I don't think it is. I think it's just doing economics correctly, faithful to our task.
And Mark Robbins is asking about, are there multiple or single models into the future? I suppose, how far do you think that we're going to have to use a variety of ways to go forward to get to where we need to?
Oh, that's for sure. I think that's absolutely very good. I'm sorry, I overlooked that question. It's not so much a multiplicity of economic models. It's a multiplicity of actions and levels of action, whether the seat of the action is the local community, which is what we were discussing a few minutes ago, or it's at the national level, whether it's at the international level. There is a multiplicity there, that's for sure, because there's a multiplicity of ecosystems, and they operate in different speeds, they are at different spatial extent, and their reach on human life is very different from ecosystem to ecosystem. So the problem is really about as profound and complex as it's possible, and the idea is to give shape to it in some sense. I have felt in the review, I came to the conclusion really that at the end of the day, there are some aspects of nature, features of nature, which makes nature as an asset very different from produced capital. And there are three in number. One is very well understood, and the entire economics of externalities follows from it, which is that nature is mobile. It moves. The wind moves. The wind blows and so forth. The water flows and all that. And that means that it really connects distant communities, right? Even if they don't see each other. What I do here is affecting the North Pole and so forth and so on. Okay, that we're familiar with that. But there are two others which are really quite intriguing. One is that many of the processes are silent, and the third is that many of the processes are invisible. And that really means that our notion of what institutions can do is rather over-exaggerated. Institutions have limits to their ability to handle our relationship with nature, because all institutions require some notion of observability of our actions or verifiability of our actions. Okay. Otherwise, you can't control somebody's work. You can't charge somebody if you don't know what that somebody has been doing. Okay. So
we're getting close to the end of time. So if it's all right, I wanted to bring in just the last few questions.
Sure.
There's three that I've got here. From Alan asking, do you think there's been sufficient profile of the link between COVID-19 and the issues raised in your report? So what's the relationship there? From Justin Pavry, asking about the role of the private sector and whether you've got examples of individual private sector companies choosing to finance the preservation or increase of natural capital and turning a profit. And then finally from Zareen Jacob, asking about whether you're influencing the UK government to think about something along the lines of the Welsh 2015 Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I suppose in a sense,
I don't know how much time I've got to answer three large questions. First one is pretty straightforward. Yes, there is connection. Largely COVID-19 is a symptom of biodiversity degradation. Okay, so that's pretty clear. And the review goes into some length. The review certainly spends quite a bit of time over the role of the private sector, the opportunities they face. In the sense, yes, the answer is even if they're not priced, these natural capital, it would be in the interest of even individual companies to mind the effect on the biosphere insofar as the firm is concerned, its entire supply chain from source to sink, because otherwise there are two risks. One is that if the ecosystem from which they derive their primary products declines in worth, then their profits are going to suffer. Okay. And the other is that in future, consumers may start becoming extremely eco-centric and then demand that you behave. And if you miss the trick, your reputation will falter. So it goes into that direction at length. And the final question, sorry, what was the third?
So it's in a sense, what legislation we might put in place. So the Welsh 2015 Wellbeing of Future.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't know that, the economics of climate change, of course, has suggested very strongly that you could have targets that you impose on countries, accept targets for emissions over time. So that's going in that direction. You then say, we're doing it because we are, the future generations demand that of us. That's you can use that legal kind of expression, of course. You can legalize it, as in movements of giving rights to ecosystems too. And they may have virtues, I don't know. But the main thing is, how do you get a behavior which is in line with the common good? And that may or may not require this kind of description as you're suggesting. But eventually, I do think that, if you want to conclude, I do think it's important that we are educated in ecology. And that was the point I was trying to get to when suggesting that institutions are not sufficient because of the special features of nature. And the review actually ends with the plea that our education system from primary education onwards, primary school onwards, includes nature studies, and it should not stop, because we need to understand something, vaguely maybe, but something like the workings of the ecosystems we happen to inhabit, the ones which are in the neighborhood. Because out of some understanding comes some form of affection. And that is the way to have the self-discipline that is required. And in other words, the self-discipline shouldn't be seen as a cost. Then, of course, it's hard. But if you care about something, then it's no longer a cost to preserve it. So that's how I went to the education side. But it came from economic reasoning, namely, this asset has some weird properties.
Well, look, Partha, thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up there, but it's been a wonderful discussion, and I think a more optimistic one than perhaps I'd expected when we started off, and really subtle and wide-ranging contribution from you, in particular thinking about the role of community and politics, as well as policy and economics. So I'd like to thank you very much, and thank all of our viewers and listeners as well. Do tune in to further British Academy events. You can find out more details on our website. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you.